And last but not least, Corey Robin, political theorist at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He's the author of Fear, The History of a Political Idea, and The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin. He's also a frequent contributor to London Review of Books and other magazines and blogs at coryrobin.com.
Thank you all for inviting me. It's nice to be speaking about this issue, not at Brooklyn College. So I've been an anti-Zionist Jew for virtually all of my adulthood, and I just actually realized, as I was listening to my co-panelists, I've actually been boycotting the state of Israel for about a quarter of a century. In fact, I distinctly remember when I began my boycott. It was the summer of 1992, and I was driving back from Tennessee with my then girlfriend at the time, who was Jewish, and I had just finished Edward Said's Question of Palestine and had been going through a process and announced in the car ride back that, if and when we got married, no child of mine was ever going to step foot on the state of Israel. And we didn't speak for a week, but I've kept to that. But I have to say that when it comes to being political about Israel and Palestine and BDS, like a lot of things in my life, I'm an accidental activist. Up until about 3 years ago, I'd never really said or done anything aside from getting into this fight with my girlfriend at the time about the issue of Israel and Palestine. And it wasn't really till about a year and a half ago that I even started thinking seriously, or even thinking much at all, about BDS. Prior to that, I would say I was either neutral or opposed to BDS. Opposed mostly because of the cultural boycott element, which, as Omar said, was, up until recently, really the dominant thing that you heard about. And like many opponents of the academic boycott today, I thought that the cultural boycott was basically pointless, silly. Who cares about what actors and musicians and writers and intellectuals think? What really matters, I thought, was, the halls of power. I'm a political scientist. We think about, power, Congress and the White House and so on. And then I had the sort of dumb luck of being part of a department that decided to co-sponsor an event about BDS. And it really was dumb luck. It was February of 2013. The Students for Justice in Palestine at Brooklyn College had invited Judith Butler and Omar Barghouti to talk about BDS on campus, and they asked the Department of Political Science, among many other departments, to co-sponsor the event, and fools that we were, we said yes. And it was, in many ways, a no-brainer for us. We had at the time, and now it unwritten, and now it's written, policy of co-sponsoring any and all campus events. Second, this was about politics in the Middle East, and we're a political science department that offers courses on politics in the Middle East. And third, personally, because I was vaguely opposed to BDS and also, honestly, kind of ignorant about it, I genuinely wanted to know what some of its foremost advocates happened to think about it. That kind of breathtakingly naive decision on our part got us into a world of trouble. And for about a month, our lives were turned upside down as the entire pro-Israel community in New York City, it seemed in the United States and around the world, mobilized to shut us down. The event, the department, my chair, all of us. Well, two things came out of this controversy. First, we won. We counter-mobilized. The event happened. We co-sponsored it, and the campus and the community got to hear Omar Barghouti and Judith Butler speak about BDS, which, I understand at NYU that's not necessarily such a big deal, but cross the river, you'll see what I'm talking about. It was a big deal. But for me personally, it suddenly dawned on me, and this is a point that's already been made, if BDS is so pointless, and if the cultural boycott in particular is so pointless, and if no one cares about what academics like me think about this issue, why is everyone from Chuck Schumer to the New York City Council, to Alan Dershowitz, to the Jerusalem Post, so freaked out about a very little department, and we are really a little department, in a fairly little college, and we really are a fairly little college, in the admittedly not so little borough of Brooklyn. Why is everybody so freaked out about us co-sponsoring a panel on BDS? I mean, not organizing for BDS, we were certainly not doing that, not endorsing BDS, because we were certainly not doing that, but just co-sponsoring a panel where people were talking about BDS. Well, as all of you know, this was really just a very small dress rehearsal for what was to come on this issue, with the BDS vote by the ASA, wherein everyone from New York State to the state of Maryland to the state of Illinois, and even it got so high at one point as people in Congress, all mobilizing to stop this thing called BDS, which, as a just a side point, at first I was amused, and now I just get annoyed when critics of BDS, say, especially a lot of academics say, you're focusing on universities. You really need to take on funding in Congress. And I think to myself, we're just talking about BDS, right now, and we're just taking these small resolutions. Look what the state is already doing to stop us. What do you think they're going to do when you start talking about defunding the state of Israel? There's this sort of massive disconnect that goes on in these criticisms. So in the last several years, it seems pretty clear that the Israel-Palestine conflict has become, one of the most hotly debated and divisive issues on college campuses in the United States. Certainly, I would say far more divisive than the debate about South Africa, which gripped my generation of college students. And in a way, I think almost more divisive, although I think some people might disagree with this, than the debate about multiculturalism and political correctness, which was roiling college campuses in the late 80s and through the 90s. I'm not a historian, so I'm allowed to make historical comments like this then. But I would say that it could be shaping up as the most divisive issue on American campuses since the Vietnam War. And the question is why? Why is this so divisive? Why does the mere discussion of the issue on college campuses freak out so many prominent, powerful, and influential forces in the United States and elsewhere? And here I think the issue of the South African divestment campaign is instructive, but not for the reason that people often cite. That is not because of the parallels between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid, but for a different reason. This is just pure conjecture, and I'm just sort of throwing this out as a thought that I've had bubbling in my mind for a bit. But it seems to me that by the time that South Africa became an issue on American college campuses in the late 70s and the early 80s, the apartheid regime there had lost all moral standing and legitimacy in the eyes of the world. Even the Reagan administration could not defend its virtues. The main argument for South Africa was really one of Cold War realpolitik. If apartheid fell, the whole country would go communist, the whole continent would go communist, and that would be the end of it. And in many ways, the battle on college campuses about South Africa, at least as I remember it, was symptomatic of that. Very few people on campuses could morally defend apartheid. The best that university administrations and their defenders could do was to say simply that moral concerns should not drive investment decisions, right? That we have a fiduciary responsibility, in case there's a nuclear war and we have to rebuild, the campus, and we need to have money for that or something like that. Today, I think the situation is almost exactly the opposite. Strategically, many national security elites think that Israel is a liability to the United States, and you periodically get a sense of this when one of them actually says what all of them seem to think in private, but can't really say in public. But culturally, politically, ideologically, Israel still has a tremendous amount of legitimacy in the media, in the halls of Congress, in churches, and elsewhere. And Israel very much depends on that legitimacy. And here I think I'm going to, unfortunately, repeat some of the things that have been said already. But among cultural institutions in the U.S., universities are today one of the few places where you do find an increasing level of disenchantment with and criticism of Israel, at least compared to other institutions. You find it among students, you find it among faculty, and for defenders of Israel, this is worrisome on two counts. First, and most obviously, universities are cultural institutions. They help make culture, and they help legitimate other institutions in the society. People in the media study at universities, and with the rise of social media, there's an increasing interaction between academics and the media. And you begin to see, in fact, in the last year or so, or 2 years, how these academic voices that are critical of Israel, you mentioned Joseph Levine, earlier, are starting to make their way into the mainstream media. I mean, when I was in college, it was, pretty much a voice like Noam Chomsky and Edward Said, and they were completely isolated within the academy. But now there are a lot of these types of voices, and they're being heard on the op-ed pages of the New York Times and elsewhere. So I think the defenders of Israel understand universities in the same way that, sorry, I'm a political theorist, Thomas Hobbes did in his analysis of the English Civil War. Quote, "The universities have been to this nation as the wooden horse was to the Trojans." The only way for ordinary people, he thought, to be brought to a love of obedience or a love of the state of Israel was for them to, quote, "listen to preachers and gentlemen that imbibe good principles in their youth at the universities." And, this always had a kind of archaic ring to it, but I think, if you start thinking about this, it actually seems more and more relevant today. If you want to build cultural hegemony or maintain it, as in the case of Israel, you've got to start early with the people who will one day become the cultural brokers of the society. So in a lot of ways, I think this does remind me of the battle over Vietnam, which, unlike the apartheid debate, really was about the nexus of the state and culture, because so many university professors, particularly in political science and my field like that, were so imbricated in the foreign policy apparatus of the state. You had this sort of blending of the state and culture right within universities. And I think in a lot of ways, Israel is very similar to that today. And that's why I see the parallels with that battle. But I think there's a second reason why it's of concern to defenders of Israel what's going on in the academy. And that is that universities are where their children go. And this is particularly about Jewish defenders of the state of Israel. Universities are where their children go after they've left home. All the major polls show that there is an increasing generational divide between younger and older Jews when it comes to the state of Israel. So here you have a younger generation which is often not necessarily opposed to the state of Israel as it is completely indifferent to it. And if you don't think that that's an important development, well, trust me, it's a very important development. Going off to college, where they're going to find themselves at lunch with anti-Zionist students, at events with anti-Zionist speakers, and in classrooms with anti-Zionist professors. And for defenders of Israel, that is a very, very scary proposition. And I think they have good reasons to be scared of it, to be honest with you. So unlike the battle over South Africa, the battle of Israel is first and foremost a kind of cultural battle, as Omar said. And we're still fighting it. And I think campuses are ground zero of that battle. So I guess just in closing, what I would say is that I see these battles, as very much dress rehearsals for where things are ultimately going to go. And I'm mystified that so many historians, especially American historians of American social movements, are so opposed to this, because they claim that they are very critical of the state of Israel and they want to do things, but they seem not to understand that a social movement that's going to take on this nexus of culture and the state, you don't just start it by going to lobby your congressman. You have to develop the arguments. You have, it's like the Montgomery bus boycott it wasn't straight for Congress. It was in a little city in Alabama. And it was the beginning where you start developing all the skills, the organizational infrastructure, the arguments, all the things that you do in a social movement so that one day you can take on what the state is doing, and that day seems to be coming faster and faster than many of us realized. But in a lot of ways, I guess just to bring it back to where it began, the very thing that I always thought was the biggest weakness about BDS, this cultural boycott, I think turns out to be, in fact, it's one of its biggest strengths. So, thanks.